Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the fascinating history of how Indian sociology was born out of a genuinely unique historical puzzle. You know, we take established academic disciplines for granted today, but if you rewind 100 years, early thinkers had to figure out what an Indian sociology would even look like, completely from scratch. So let's dive into this core dilemma right off the bat. When early scholars began looking at India through a sociological lens, they faced a massive contradiction. Think about it. How do you take a Western academic discipline and adapt it to an ancient, highly advanced civilization that is, at the exact same time, experiencing the crushing weight of colonial subjugation? It definitely wasn't as simple as just copying and pasting a textbook. To put that into perspective, Western sociology emerged primarily to make sense of modernity and the rapid industrialization of Europe. But the Indian reality was entirely different. India's very first taste of modernity wasn't through an independent industrial revolution at all. It was completely intertwined with being a colony. On top of that, Western anthropology often studied so-called primitive cultures from a total outsider's perspective. Indian scholars, though, had to study their own ancient civilization, which just so happened to contain indigenous tribes within it. Here is our roadmap for the Explainer today. We'll start with the contextual puzzle, meet the accidental pioneers, look at Ghurye and his institutionalization, decode caste, explore Mukerji's living tradition, and finish up with how the field adapted to the present.
All right, Section 1, the contextual puzzle. Let's see how the field actually got its start.
So, this discipline didn't just happen overnight. Indian sociology slowly transformed from the passionate side projects of amateurs into formal university departments over several decades. It really started back in 1898 when S.C. Roy moved to Ranchi, and then in 1902 with L.K.I. Iyer beginning an ethnographic survey. But formal institutional teaching? That didn't actually begin until 1919 at the University of Bombay. Soon after that, in the 1920s, Calcutta and Lucknow opened their own departments. It took over 2 decades to make that leap from the field to the classroom.
Moving on to Section 2, the accidental pioneers, going from amateurs to experts. Get this, the earliest Indian anthropologists didn't even start out as academics. Take L.K. Anathakrishna Iyer. He started his career as a clerk, then a school teacher, and later a college teacher in Cochin State. In 1902, the British government wanted records of the princely states, so he was asked to help with an ethnographic survey. And he did this completely voluntarily. He taught college during the week and worked as an unpaid superintendent of ethnography on the weekends. Talk about a side hustle, right? That practical administrative work pushed him into becoming a self-taught, internationally recognized anthropologist who eventually helped set up India's first postgraduate anthropology department.
And then there's Sarat Chandra Roy. He literally stumbled into anthropology. He was an English teacher turned lawyer who moved to Ranchi in 1898. As he practiced law, he quickly realized he had a massive professional need to interpret tribal customs and laws for the local courts. Honestly, he just couldn't defend his clients properly without understanding their culture. This drove him to travel all over and do intensive fieldwork among tribal communities, again, purely on an amateur basis. But he kept at it, eventually becoming the leading authority on Chotanagpur cultures and even founding the journal Man in India in 1922.
Section 3, Ghurye and institutionalization. Let's look at the real institution building phase.
Those previous pioneers lived entirely under British rule. The next generation came of age in the colonial era, but really pushed the discipline toward independence. Enter G.S. Ghurye. His legacy is absolutely immense. I mean, he headed the Bombay University Sociology Department for an incredible 35 years. He successfully combined teaching and research under one roof, merged social anthropology with sociology, and founded the Indian Sociological Society. He is, without a doubt, the true institution builder of the discipline. A big part of Ghurye's prominence came from this massive, ongoing debate in the 1930s and 40s regarding tribal communities. You had 2 main camps. The protectionists, who were mostly British administrator anthropologists, argued that the state had a strict duty to preserve tribal culture, to protect them from exploitation and cultural extinction by mainstream society. On the flip side, you had the nationalists, with Ghurye as their best-known exponent. They argued that trying to meticulously preserve tribes basically kept them as backward museums of primitive culture. Ghurye asserted that tribes were actually backward Hindus who had been interacting with mainstream culture for ages and were just further behind in the same assimilation process that all Indian communities go through.
It's a fascinating standoff, mainly because this tension, preservation versus assimilation, is still incredibly relevant today when we discuss modern development projects like big dams and mining operations. All right, Section 4, decoding caste and race and challenging some deeply held views.
So the real turning point in Ghurye's career was how he challenged the prevailing British colonial theories about Indian society. A British official named Herbert Risley pushed a really dominant theory, arguing that caste originated strictly from distinct racial types. He suggested upper castes were Aryan and lower castes were Aboriginal non-Aryans, actually using physical measurements like nose length to try and prove it. But Ghurye took Risley's own anthropometric data and offered a brilliant critique. He showed that this idea of racial purity was broadly true only for North India. In the rest of the country, the data clearly showed that different racial groups had been mixing for centuries before strict caste endogamy was ever introduced. So his point was that caste in most of India simply couldn't be explained purely by distinct racial origins.
But Ghurye didn't just critique theories, he defined them. To break down this super dense theory of caste, Ghurye defined it using 6 comprehensive, highly structured features based on classical texts. Number 1, segmental division, meaning your caste is a closed compartment decided entirely by birth. 2, it is strictly hierarchical. 3, severe restrictions on social interaction, especially regarding food and touch, driven by ideas of purity and pollution. 4, differential rights and duties for different castes. 5, a restricted, hereditary choice of occupation. And 6, strict rules around marriage, specifically endogamy, which means marrying only within your own caste. Now, obviously, practice has changed over the decades, but this definition provided a systematic, rock-solid baseline for all future sociologists studying independent India.
Moving to Section 5, Mukerji's Living Tradition. Welcome to the Lucknow School. Shifting over to the famous Lucknow department, we meet D.P. Mukerji. He brought a completely fresh theoretical voice to the table. Just look at this provocative quote. India had had society and very little else. In fact, she had too much of it. That perfectly encapsulates his worldview. He actually came to sociology through history and economics because he felt those fields just didn't fit India. In the West, the economy or the state drove history. But in India, Mukerji argued that history, economics, and philosophy were always centered on social groups. India literally had too much society. Therefore, the absolute first duty of an Indian sociologist was to study and deeply understand Indian social traditions. And that brings us to his core concept, parampara. Mukerji argued that any good sociologist has to realize that Indian traditions aren't static, dusty museum pieces. They are a living tradition. This means the tradition maintains a firm link with the past by holding on to key elements, but it's incredibly resilient because it actively incorporates new things and adapts to the present. Think of it like this. Tradition isn't something that stops change. It is the very vehicle through which change is negotiated in India. Digging into the classical texts, Mukerji identified 3 main principles of change within these Indian traditions. You have Shruti, which is revelation, you have Smriti, which is memory. And the third is Anubhava, which means personal and collective experience. Mukerji pointed out that Anubhava is the real revolutionary principle here. In the West, you might see class conflict driving societal change. But in India, Mukerji argued, change happens when the high traditions, Shruti and Smriti, are challenged by the collective experience and love of the people. You see this clearly in things like the Bhakti or Sufi movements. It's rebellion, but rebellion contained within the limits of an overarching tradition. Finally, Section 6, adapting to the present and bringing in new frameworks. Scholars like A.R. Desai further adapted the field by bringing in entirely different theoretical frameworks to understand a newly independent nation. Desai was a lifelong Marxist, and in his famous 1948 work, The Social Background of Indian Nationalism, he applied a strict Marxist analysis to understand the Indian nationalist movement. His approach put the spotlight on economic processes and divisions, analyzing how the specific material conditions of British colonialism actually birthed the nationalist movement. It was a pretty stark contrast to just studying ancient texts, and it really shows just how broad and adaptable Indian sociology had become. As we wrap up this explainer on the chapter, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. How have the living traditions right in your own neighborhood adapted over the last 10, 20, or even 40 years? Just think about the childhood games people play, the specific way a popular festival is celebrated, or even traditional clothing. What has stayed the exact same and what has actively incorporated the new? Once you start looking for it, I guarantee you'll see D.P. Mukerji's theories of a living, breathing tradition playing out right outside your front door. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the world around you.
Catch you next time.